The wind screaming across the Siberian steppe doesn't just feel cold. It feels like an assault. Your fingers are so numb they've lost all feeling, but you can't stop working. If you stop, you freeze. You are kneeling on a frozen sheet of ice, struggling to pull a thick, stiff animal hide tight enough to punch a hole through it with a sharp piece of flint. The air is so dry and freezing that every breath you draw feels like swallowing broken glass. If your shelter fails tonight, you won't wake up tomorrow. Think about how you woke up this morning. You probably rolled out of bed, walked over to a plastic dial on your wall, and turned it. In less than 15 minutes, invisible currents of air heated your entire home to a perfect, stable 72 degrees. It took zero physical effort. But 30,000 years ago, staying warm was a full-time, high-stakes engineering job. It required hundreds of hours of mind-numbing manual labor, intense chemical processes, and the strength to drag 300-pound bones across miles of frozen tundra. So how did they survive? To understand how our ancestors conquered the Ice Age, we have to start with a massive technological leap that happened 50,000 years ago in a dark, freezing cave in Siberia. Before this moment, humans wore clothes, but they weren't really clothes. They were just heavy drapes. You killed a deer, skinned it, scraped the fat off, and tied the raw hide around your shoulders like a heavy, stiff blanket. It kept some heat in, but it had a massive flaw: the wind. If you're walking through an Ice Age blizzard and a gust of sub-zero wind gets under your loose animal hide, it instantly sweeps away the layer of warm air your body has spent hours heating up. Your core temperature plummets. You get hypothermia. But 50,000 years ago, someone inside that Siberian cave changed everything. Archaeologists digging through the deep, frozen dirt found a tiny, delicate object made of animal bone. It was an eyed needle. It sounds simple, but the eyed needle is a piece of high-tech machinery. It allowed humans to transition from basic punching tools to actual, sophisticated tailoring. Instead of tying hides together, they could now sew tight, overlapping seams. And we know exactly what those clothes looked like because of a spectacular 30,000-year-old burial site in western Russia. When archaeologists excavated the graves of a man and 2 children buried there, they didn't just find bones. They found over 10,000 perfectly preserved beads carved from mammoth ivory. These beads weren't just scattered, they were still aligned exactly where they had been sewn onto the dead kids' clothes. By mapping the position of those 10,000 beads, researchers reconstructed the ultimate Ice Age outfit. It wasn't a crude loincloth or a loose fur cape. It was a complete, form-fitting, multi-layered system. They wore fitted leather trousers, tight jackets, heavy fur-lined boots, and form-fitting hoods that pulled tight around the face. It was, quite literally, a prehistoric spacesuit. It trapped a layer of dead air right against the skin, creating a microclimate of pure warmth that no Arctic wind could penetrate. But to make a spacesuit, you need the right tools. And that brings us to a tiny campsite in Wyoming, dating back 13,000 years. While excavating the remains of a butchered mammoth, archaeologists sifted through the dirt and found 32 tiny, broken bone needles. But when they ran a chemical analysis on the bone proteins to see what kind of animal they came from, they got a massive shock. The needles weren't made from the massive, sturdy bones of the mammoth they had just killed. They weren't even made from bison bones. They were carved from the bones of red foxes, bobcats, and mountain lions. Think about that. Why would a group of freezing hunters spend hours hunting down small, fast, dangerous predators just to use their bones for needles? Because of physics. A mammoth bone is incredibly dense and thick. If you try to carve a needle out of it, the needle is going to be bulky. A bulky needle makes a large hole in the leather, and a large hole lets in a draft. But the leg bones of a red fox or a bobcat are naturally thin, hollow, and light. By using these bones, early tailors could craft needles so thin and delicate that the seams they sewed were completely airtight. If the wind can't find a single millimeter of open space in your seam, it can't kill you. They were hunting predators not for their meat, but for their engineering properties. By every logical measure, humans should have died out during the Ice Age. We are, biologically speaking, tropical animals. We have no natural fur. Our skin is thin. We sweat to dump heat because we are designed to run across the blazing hot African savanna. If you strip a modern human naked and drop them into a Siberian winter, they will be dead in under 20 minutes. We are completely unsuited for the cold. Yet, we didn't just survive. We pushed further north into the deep freeze than almost any other primate in history. And we did it by turning our campsites into literal chemistry labs. Take our ancient cousins, the Neanderthals. For a long time, popular culture painted them as dim-witted, muscular brutes who just huddled in caves shivering. But archaeology has completely shattered that myth. 200,000 years ago, in what is now Germany, Neanderthals wanted to attach sharp stone points to their wooden spears. But they needed a glue that wouldn't dissolve in the damp, freezing cold. So they invented industrial chemistry. Scientists analyzed black, crusty residue on ancient stone tools and found it was birch bark tar. But here is the thing. You cannot make birch tar by just throwing birch bark into a campfire. If you do that, the bark just burns to ash. To get tar, you have to heat the bark to over 300 degrees in a completely oxygen-free environment. Neanderthals did this by digging precise underground pits, sealing the birch bark inside away from any air, and building a fire directly on top of the soil. It was a highly controlled, multi-step distillation process that required intense planning and temperature management. And it produced a waterproof, freeze-resistant industrial adhesive that kept their weapons together in sub-zero blizzards. But they didn't stop at glue. Neanderthals also hacked the physics of fire. In caves across France, archaeologists kept finding strange blocks of a black, chalky mineral called manganese dioxide. For decades, scientists assumed they were just using it as black pigment for cave paintings. But then researchers noticed something odd. The blocks had heavy scraping marks on them, as if they were being ground down into powder. So they ran an experiment. They ground up manganese dioxide and sprinkled it onto firewood. The result was mind-blowing. Normally, dry wood needs to reach 350 degrees Celsius before it will ignite. But when you coat the wood in manganese dioxide powder, the chemical reaction lowers the ignition temperature to just 250 degrees. Think about how crucial that is. If you are freezing to death in a damp cave, and your firewood is cold and slightly wet, starting a fire by striking flint and pyrite is incredibly difficult. But by grinding up this specific mineral and using it as a chemical fire starter, Neanderthals could get a fire roaring with a fraction of the heat. They were using chemistry to cheat the cold, and their own bodies were physically re-engineered by evolution to fight the freeze. Neanderthals had short, stocky limbs and wide, heavy trunks. This wasn't just random. A short, thick shape naturally minimizes the surface area of your skin relative to your total body mass. Less surface area means less room for your body heat to radiate away into the freezing air. Even their faces were built for the cold. If you look at a Neanderthal skull, the nasal cavity is absolutely massive. Using advanced computer modeling, scientists simulated how air flows through that shape. They discovered that the giant Neanderthal nose was actually a highly advanced, built-in air conditioner. When you inhale sub-zero, bone-dry Arctic air, it can shock your throat and damage your lungs. But as that freezing air entered the wide, complex passages of the Neanderthal nose, the internal structure rapidly warmed and humidified the air before it ever reached their internal organs. Their faces were literal heat exchangers. But even with biological adapters, chemical fire hacks, and airtight spacesuits, you still need a place to sleep when the temperature drops to 40 below zero. And that presents a massive architectural crisis. If you are living on the vast, flat plains of ancient Ukraine or Russia during the height of the Ice Age, there are no forests. The landscape is a treeless, frozen tundra. There is no wood to build a cabin. There are no caves to shelter in. So what do? You build your house out of the only massive structural material available on the tundra: mammoths. At a site in Ukraine called Prehistoric, archaeologists discovered the remains of 4 ancient circular dwellings. They weren't just temporary tents. They were heavy, permanent architectural masterpieces ranging up to 260 square feet. And they were built entirely out of mammoth bones. To build just one of these houses, ancient humans collected and interlocked 149 massive mammoth bones. They used heavy, flat jawbones to create a solid, interlocking foundation ring on the frozen ground. Then, they stacked hundreds of massive ribs and skulls to form strong, load-bearing walls, using the heavy, curved tusks to arch over the top to support a roof. They draped heavy animal hides over this massive bone framework, and then piled dirt, turf, and tundra moss over the top to create a thick layer of natural insulation. Inside the center of these bone domes, they built stone hearths. Because the bone walls were sealed with thick turf, the heat from a single small fire would bounce off the curved bone ceiling, trapping the warmth inside and keeping the interior cozy while 40-mile-per-hour blizzards raged outside. And these weren't just quick shelters. New radiocarbon dating shows that these mammoth bone houses were occupied and maintained for over 400 years. Generations of families lived, slept, and stayed warm inside these bone domes, looking up at ceilings made of mammoth skulls while the world outside was locked in ice. So, tonight, when you walk over to your wall and turn that plastic thermostat dial, take a second to listen. Listen to the faint click of the switch. Listen to the quiet rush of warm air coming through the vents. It is incredibly easy for us to feel completely disconnected from the people who lived tens of thousands of years ago. We look at our modern technology, our heaters, our insulated jackets, our concrete homes, and we think we are a completely different species. But we aren't. The only reason you can turn that dial today is because 30,000 years ago, an ancient family was huddled inside a dome made of mammoth skulls, hand-stitching foxbone needles through thick leather, and using chemical powders to keep a tiny flame alive in the dark. If you survive this far, you've got what it takes to make it through the Ice Age. Do me a favor. Hit subscribe so you don't miss our next wild dive into the deep past. Drop a comment below. Honestly, would you have survived the freeze, or would you have been the first to go? And if you appreciate central heating, leave a like. See you next time.